Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of El Monitor, and this week we'll be talking with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He's the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, the former National Security Advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump, and author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. General McMaster and I will talk about his book, Battlegrounds, the Trump administration's record in the Middle East, how HR's experiences in 2 wars in Iraq shaped his approach to Iraq and the region, and what he would advise the next administration, whether it be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, in dealing with Iran and the Middle East. My conversation with H.R. McMaster begins after this short break.
I think it would be a mistake if it is a Biden administration for them to re-enter what was a really flawed agreement. In fact, what I think is a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph. And what's wrong with the deal is, first of all, it just postponed Iran gaining a threshold capability with the sunset clause. And then it had real problems in the area of verification. It didn't prohibit big components of programs that could pose a grave threat to all of us, in particular the missile program. And so it would be a huge mistake to resurrect that flawed deal. And I think what's immensely important now, and what the biggest accomplishment of the Trump administration has been, is to put the economic pressure on the regime to force a choice. And ultimately, of course, it will be up to the Iranian people to voice a desire to change the nature of their government. But what I think we ought to recognize is that until the Iranian regime ceases its permanent hostility, a conciliatory approach just won't work.
That was General H.R. McMaster, who will be joining us in just a moment. I'm going to forego my usual commentary at this point in the podcast and get right into the introduction of our guest. H.R. McMaster is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, and he received a Ph.D. in American History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His Ph.D. thesis was critical of American strategy and military leadership during the Vietnam War, and that dissertation served as the basis for his first book, Dereliction of Duty, which is widely read in the U.S. military and a mainstay for courses on U.S. military history. McMaster served his country as commander in wartime in Afghanistan and twice in Iraq, and we'll be talking with him about how those experiences of combat in both Iraq wars informed his approach to that country and to the region. From 2014 to 2017, General McMaster designed the Future Army as director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and deputy commanding general of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. In 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump appointed General McMaster as his national security advisor. I could go on. General McMaster has a long list of decorations and awards for his distinguished military service and many accomplishments. For more than 2 decades, he has been involved in military strategy and policy making in the Middle East. Army Chief of Staff General Martin Dempsey remarked in 2011 that McMaster was, quote, probably our best brigadier general. McMaster made Time's list of the 100 most influential people in the world in April 2014. H.R. McMaster is now the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he is the author this year of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, which we'll be talking with him about. And it's a book about how to reshape American national security strategy to meet the challenges of this century. Our conversation about the Middle East with General H.R. McMaster begins now. HR, welcome to On the Middle East.
Hey, thanks, Andrew. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you with us. Let's get right into it. We are talking during the final stretch of a U.S. presidential election campaign, which will likely have an impact on U.S. policy in the Middle East. And Probably the biggest challenge the next administration will face in the region is Iran. Now, you have two chapters in Battlegrounds on the threat and challenge from Iran. You were not a fan of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and you explain why in your book, writing that, quote, while the JCPOA was presented as a major turn in American policy, in fact, it was consistent with a long history of errors and illusions. Now, as National Security Advisor, you tried to hold off withdrawing from the Iran deal, however, until the administration had a new Iran strategy in place. Former Vice President Joe Biden is criticized with withdrawal from the Iran deal, and if elected, would rejoin if Iran is in compliance. And President Trump has said consistently he's open to a new, better deal on Iran. How do you assess the Trump policy on Iran? And whoever is elected, would you advise against re-entering the deal? And if not, how to deal with Iran? Is a deal even possible?
Well, hey, thanks, Andrew. Well, I think that we make a mistake when we consider policy actions toward Iran without considering two fundamental dynamics. The first of these is the ideology that drives the regime, the ideology of the revolution, and then the related factor that Iran has been fighting a 40-year-long proxy war against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, the Arab monarchies, and the West broadly. And so what I argue in Battlegrounds is that we have to force a choice. We have to force the Iranian regime to make a choice to either stop the proxy war and be treated like any other nation, or to continue its activities and remain in isolation economically. You know, Andrew, I wanted to stay in the deal to keep the conversation about the Iranian regime and its behavior. And I felt that once we pulled out, the conversation would be about us. I wanted us to be able to sanction Iran's behavior outside of the regime, hold them to the deal, with and then over time try to correct the flaws in the deal. Well, I mean, once we pulled out, of course, I don't think that's feasible any longer. But I think it would be a mistake if it is a Biden administration for them to re-enter what was a really flawed agreement. It was a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph. And what was wrong with the deal is, first of all, it just postponed Iran gaining a threshold capability with the sunset clause. And then it had real problems in the area of verification. It didn't prohibit big components of programs that could pose a grave threat to all of us, in particular the missile program. And so it would be a huge mistake to resurrect that flawed deal. And I think what's immensely important now, and what the biggest accomplishment of the Trump administration has been, is to put the economic pressure on the regime to force a choice. And ultimately, of course, it will be up to the Iranian people to voice a desire to change the nature of their government. But what I think we ought to recognize is that until the Iranian regime ceases its permanent hostility, a conciliatory approach just won't work.
Let's talk for a minute about Saudi Arabia. You write in your book about the high hopes the Trump administration had for partnership with the kingdom, but those hopes were dashed, as you explain, by some of the actions of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. You were with President Trump on a pretty dramatic trip to the kingdom, the president's first Middle East trip. And you write that, quote, in the Middle East, partners can be as vexing as adversaries, but sustained engagement and a willingness to sanction human rights abuses or support for extremist and terrorist organizations are foundational to long-term strategy in the region. Now, what's your verdict on the future of U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia? How do you keep the kingdom in the camp of partner in dealing with Iran, extremist groups, energy policy, for example, and in the meantime, addressing human rights and other concerns, such as the outrage over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi?
Right. Well, I think we ought to have a goal in mind, and that goal should be that Saudi Arabia become part of the solution across the Middle East instead of part of the problem. And as you know, since the 1970s, really mainly in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, it was the kingdom's proselytization of a warped interpretation of Islam, an extremist version of Islam that was used as a basis for radicalizing impressionable young people, and then enlisting them in physical jihad against their fellow Muslims and against everybody else, right? So who did not adhere to their narrow and a perverted interpretation of Islam. So I think the question is, can the regime become a force for good in the world? I think it can, and this was the this was the purpose of President Trump's visit. Of course, Andrew, everybody thought in 2017, what the heck is Donald Trump doing going to Riyadh for his first trip? They thought this was difficult to understand. But if you go back and read President Trump's speech and King Solomon's speech, these were landmark speeches. As it turns out, they were aspirational, but they were also practical in connection with the establishment of an institution for countering radical Islamist ideology, as well as a multinational effort to cut off terrorist and extremist funding. Both those efforts have borne some fruit, I think, and are worth continuing to pursue. And of course, as you mentioned, though, there have been some significant disappointments in connection with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a U.S. resident and a journalist, as well as Mohammed bin Salman's means of consolidating power. Now, Andrew, you may understand it, but I just don't understand the politics within the Saudi royal family. But I do hope that they will shift in favor of reform. Will continue some of the reforms that the Crown Prince has initiated in terms of reforms associated with women's rights, for example, in the kingdom, reforms associated with no longer promoting this ideology that can be used as a justification for terrorist actions.
HR, let's talk about Turkey. In Battlegrounds, you write that, quote, improved cooperation may not be possible. A strategy for the region should therefore consider how to mitigate the loss of Turkey as an ally while moving towards a transactional relationship. Tell us how you see where U.S.-Turkey relations are and how you see them progressing.
I'm sad about it. I think that Turkey's drift away from Europe and the United States and the West has been maybe the greatest geostrategic shift since the end of the Cold War, and it's not in our interests. And so what I hope to see is that hopefully President Erdogan would realize that that he is actually acting against Turkish interests when he aids and abets the Russians. I mean, hopefully he's having some buyer's remorse about that relationship, as now he is engaged through his proxies against Russian proxies in Idlib, in Libya, and now in Nagorno-Karabakh. And what I'm concerned about, obviously, with Turkey as well, is the degree to which Turkey continues to use, I think, its fight against the PKK as a way to rally nationalist sentiment, as well as now an increasingly anti-Western and anti-U.S. propaganda in a media that is controlled now by the state. You know, the AKP has been very effective at taking over state institutions and functions in a way that's undemocratic. So I think all the trends are in the wrong direction with Turkey. Kemalism, and the three pillars of Westernism, secularism, and nationalism have been warped in a way into an Islamist nationalist ideology with the AKP that is inherently anti-Western. And what I would try to explain to my Turkish friends when I was national security advisor is, hey, consider all the countries that made anti-Americanism central to their propaganda efforts internal to their countries, and where did they end up? It's not a pretty picture. So I think that we ought to be working very aggressively at cultivating positive relationships with Turkish entities that are not under Erdogan's wing of the AKP. And as you know, the AKP itself is not monolithic or homogeneous. And in a post-Erdogan era, we want to have good relationships with leaders within the AKP, but also, and maybe even especially, in other political parties and in civil society and business to business relationships are going to be important. Turkey is in many ways acting against its interest because 80% of its trade is with Europe. And this idea of buying like S-400 missiles from Russia that then could result in the imposition of U.S. sanctions. I mean, it just doesn't seem rational. I think that's because it's not rational. It is in large measure ideological.
We've talked a little already about Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. How do you assess the Trump record overall on the Middle East? And what about the battle against Islamic State and extremists? And say something, if you could, about the normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan.
Right. So I think the acceleration of the campaign to defeat ISIS was positive, as has been the sustained engagement in Iraq and engagement in Iraq that was in support of Iraqi sentiments against the complete alignment with Iran and the loss of Iraqi sovereignty to Iranian infiltration and subversion of the Iraqi state. I think that's been a positive policy. As I mentioned, I think the approach toward Iran overall has been a positive policy. I think with the strike against Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes and Qasem Soleimani, I think that was the righteous use of violence against someone who was actively generating attacks against U.S. citizens and our interests in the region. And I think that's a positive in terms of Middle East policy. But what's a negative, Andrew, I think is a continuation of this narrative that the Middle East is just mainly a mess to be avoided, and that our disengagement from the region would be an unmitigated good, under the belief that it just can't get worse. But as we know, when you think it can't get worse in the Middle East, it actually can get worse. And so it's important, I think, to maintain our commitment to working with the Syrian Democratic Forces, for example, in eastern Syria, as a way to maintain influence, to help get to a resolution of the Syrian civil war and addressing its humanitarian crises, and then also limiting Iranian influence in a post civil war Syria. And it's also important to remain engaged in Syria and in Iraq to complete the defeat of ISIS. I mean, we should learn from December 2011 that when you leave a war, one side disengages. That doesn't mean the competition is over. I would say another positive aspect, though, of the approach to the region has been this cultivation of the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states under the recognition that their security interests are in broad alignment. And I love the Abraham Accords because of the name, because the name communicates to our friends in the region that we are all people of the book. It is important in connection with limiting Iran's ability to continue its 4-decade-long proxy war, but it's also important in removing sources of ideological support from jihadist terrorist organizations who want to portray their criminal and political agenda as a war of religion, when in fact, of course, we know that the vast majority of victims of these terrorists are fellow Muslims.
Let's talk a little more about U.S. policy toward Iraq, which you just mentioned, but I want to go back in time. I want to start almost 30 years ago when then Captain McMaster received the Silver Star for valor for the Battle of 73 Easting. Now, obviously, a very successful, if not historic, engagement. It's studied in war colleges, one of the decisive military campaigns of the 91 war. Tell us how that battle, I believe that was your first combat assignment and your first engagement in the region, shaped your thinking about Iraq and the Middle East.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I do write about this in the book. In the introduction, I write about the battle, and then I write later on the 2 chapters on the Greater Middle East about our experience after the battle, which I think is even more significant in Ur and near Nasiriyah. Ur, of course, Ur of the Chaldees being Abraham's birthplace, and there's a famous archaeological site there of the ziggurat and the catacombs associated with Abraham's birthplace. 4,000 years ago. We were right next to the Tallil Air Base and on the road to Baghdad. And of course, our cavalry troop, as you mentioned, during the Battle of 73 Easting, we had achieved a lopsided victory over the Republican Guard brigade and elements of an armored division, and suffered, thankfully, no casualties in that fight. But it was in the occupation of southern Iraq when I began to understand better how fractious and fragmented Iraqi society had become under the brutality of Saddam's regime, especially how the Shia population in the south had suffered, and in particular how Shia tribal leadership had been affected, attacked really by the regime, and how difficult it would have been if we had gone to Baghdad to really fashion a kind of post-Ba'ath Party government. And it was during that period of time that I changed my views. Initially, I was predisposed for, well, let's just go to Baghdad, and if Saddam is this bad of a guy, which he was, let's get rid of him just right now. But when I went back to the United States on vacation after the war, I wrote an op-ed for my local newspaper that was entitled "Why the U.S. Was Right in Not Taking Over All of Iraq." And it was because of the problems that we would encounter in a post-Saddam Iraq. And I mentioned in the op-ed an insurgency, the empowerment of Iran, and how difficult it would be to achieve effective governance and rule of law in a post-Ba'ath Party Iraq, and how it would be require a commitment of many, many years without any guarantee of success.
You were back in Iraq 2004. You commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment to retake the Iraqi town of Tel Afar from terrorists. And this campaign was both successful and became a kind of model for counterinsurgency efforts as the U.S. pivoted to the surge strategy a few years later. At this time, you also write in the book about how you became close to then Member of Parliament, later Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. Tell us about Tel Afar, your experience there, and what it taught you, continuing this experience you've had with Iraq now on another combat mission, about Iraq and counterinsurgency warfare in the region.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Tel Afar was really, I think, representative of all of the problems of Iraq in microcosm when we got there in 2005. And I had the opportunity to serve on General John Abizaid's staff between 2003 to 2004. So I traveled to Iraq multiple times and to Afghanistan as well. And in the course of traveling to Iraq, I'd met parliamentarian Haider al-Abadi and forged a relationship with him. Saw him again before, as our regiment shifted from the South Baghdad area, the Mahmudiyya, Ludafiya, Yusufiyya area, up to Nineveh province, centered on Tel Afar. And as we got to the area, we asked really first order questions. What is the nature of the conflict here? What is driving the violence? And what we found is that ongoing there was a cycle of sectarian violence that had permitted Al-Qaeda in Iraq to portray itself as patrons and protectors of Sunni Arab and Sunni Turkmen communities who feared complete evisceration at the hands of what they believed was an Iranian-dominated hostile Shia government and militias, tribal militias that it was employing against them. And so what that allowed is it allowed Al-Qaeda in Iraq to launch a massive offensive across Nineveh province and then to gain control in large measure of Tel Afar, except for a small Shia neighborhood that had barricaded itself in the southwest portion of the city. And what we found was really a dystopian environment in which Al-Qaeda was carrying out the most egregious acts against the Shia population and in mixed neighborhoods of the city. And while then the reaction was for Shia militias, many of which were evident and members of the police force, were conducting retribution attacks against the Sunni Arab communities and Sunni Turkmen communities. And so this cycle of violence was accelerating, and what was needed is a method to break that cycle of violence. So what we did is we partnered with courageous Iraqi forces who we trained with and helped improve their combat effectiveness, and we conducted a large-scale offensive in Tel Afar after evacuating the civilian population. We killed hundreds of the enemy. We captured about 1,000 additional across Nineveh province. And then by breaking that cycle of violence, we could get to the next step, which is to put into place mediating mechanisms that brought communities together, that restored confidence in reformed security forces, police in particular. And then what happened, Andrew, is we saw life come back to the city. It was a phenomenal change. Schools that had been closed for over a year opened. Marketplaces were thriving. where the streets had been empty. Now there were children out playing, and you could hear laughter, and it was just immensely rewarding for us to see this dramatic change, and to see life come back to the city. And we were immensely proud of what we accomplished. It convinced me, as I worked later in Washington and then back in Iraq, that the surge had to first address this cycle of sectarian violence and to help forge a political accommodation between Iraq's communities that removed support for extremist organizations, terrorist organizations, and militias that were perpetuating this cycle of violence. There need to be emphasis on capable security forces, but security forces that were viewed as legitimate by the population. And we also needed to ensure that that improvements in governance would deliver services on a non-sectarian basis and to bring Iraqis back together. I think that's still the challenge for the Iraqi government today. I believe that Iran wants to keep Iraq perpetually weak by applying the Hezbollah model to Iraq, by effecting capture over state institutions and functions, to have a weak Iraqi government that is dependent on Iran for support while it grows militias, the Hashd-Shabi, these other groups, the PMF forces, other militias, Hezbollah groups, and so forth, AAH groups that can be turned against the Iraqi government if the Iraqi government acts against Iranian interests. This is the problem that Mustafa al-Kadhimi faces, the current prime minister, and other leaders in Iraq who want to make Iraq strong, who want Iraq to emerge from these crises of recent decades and give the Iraqi people the future that they deserve. So I think that requires sustained commitment by the United States, but sustained commitment with the recognition that Iran is continuing to actively subvert the Iraqi state. And if the Iraqi state succumbs to it, of course, this is what allows groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to remain strong and to regain popular support.
Are you optimistic about Iraq's future?
I mean, optimism in Iraq it's difficult for the same sentence sometimes, but I am. In the long term, yes. I mean, Iraq is not naturally aligned with Iran. I mean, Iraqis don't want to sign up for Vlad al-Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent. They want to be subservient to the supreme leader of Iran. But what it's going to take to bring Iraqis together. It's going to take generating the political will to take on these interconnected problems of sectarianism and corruption. I quote my friend and former Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi in the chapter on what do we do about this really sectarian civil war that's manifest across the greater Middle East. And when he made the observation, he said, corruption and sectarianism go together. And I think that it's really, you see that in Lebanon, of course, in dramatic fashion, as that country is in free fall with the collapse of its financial system. And I think you see that certainly with the Assad regime. And you see that with what Iran has been trying to do through their Houthi proxies in Yemen as well. So I think it's important for the whole region to recognize this threat and to work together to overcome it.
In your book, you come back to the concepts of strategic narcissism and the U.S. approach to the region and the lack of what you call strategic empathy, and that's often affected our policies there. Do you think the U.S. is learning in terms of its approach to the Middle East after this engagement with Iraq and the region over the previous decades?
Andrew, not yet. And I'm concerned about this, right? Because I think that there is a constituency in both political parties that do see the Middle East as mainly a mess to be avoided and see our disengagement there as an unmitigated good. I think that it's fair to say that the Bush administration underappreciated the risks and costs of action when we invaded Iraq in 2003. But I think it's also fair to say that the Obama administration and the Trump administration both have underestimated the risks and costs of disengagement from the region. And I think that what we need is to be able to make a case for a sustained commitment, not a massive commitment in the region, or even a preponderantly military commitment, but a sustained diplomatic engagement in the region, to help the region get through these crises. I mean, I think the Abraham Accords are an example of how American diplomacy can play a positive role in the region. And so I think that what we have to be able to do better is explain to the American people what is at stake. And I think what is at stake are really certainly our security interests. Problems that originate in the Middle East, of course, don't stay confined to the Middle East. We see that with this humanitarian catastrophe associated with these serial episodes of mass homicide that is the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS, and how that generated a refugee crisis that affected countries in the region, certainly the people who had to flee, but also that affected Europe in a way, in a significant way, in terms of political polarization within Europe over the refugee issue. And then, of course, jihadist terrorists, the organizations that are based in the Middle East, if they enjoy a safe haven and support base, as did Al Qaeda when it controlled territory the size of Great Britain, can be a very grave threat uh, across the world. So I think that explaining what is at stake to the American people, but then also explaining how a sustained approach to the region can produce positive results. First, by breaking the cycle of sectarian violence, and then evolving toward a new form of governance in the region that gets beyond the serial failures, right, of colonialism, of the Arab monarchies, of the socialist Arab nationalist dictatorships, and now of course the failure of Islamist movements as well. So I think that the region is overdue for improvements in these areas, and U.S. partnership across the region can be a force for good.
You anticipated my next question. You've made a strong case today, and you make a strong case in your book that the U.S. needs to stay engaged. Do you think it's possible to muster domestic support for such engagement when there are voices now on both the right and the left calling for an end to endless wars?
Yes, because these so-called endless wars are actually commitments that are much smaller in scale, obviously, than they were at the height of the wars in places like Iraq and in Afghanistan. And what we have found is we are working now with partners who are bearing the brunt of the fight against enemies of all civilized peoples. I mean, Iran has done immense damage across the Arab world, and working with partners who want to save their countries, from the pernicious threat of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. I think it's worth giving them our support. And also, of course, it is the countries in the region that are bearing the brunt of the fight against jihadist terrorist organizations, well, which I believe is essentially the modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. I think it's worth pointing out in Afghanistan, for example, while 10 American soldiers have made the ultimate sacrifice and given the last full measure to protect all of us from jihadist terrorists, that about 30 Afghan security forces, police and army, give their lives every day to preserve the freedoms that the Afghan people have enjoyed since 2001. And I think that is what's most important, is for the United States to stay engaged with those who are trying to build a better future for generations to come. And as we know from the COVID-19 pandemic, Andrew, problem sets and challenges that develop overseas can only be dealt with at exorbitant cost once they reach our shores.
Finally, I wanted to end on a kind of personal note. I was pleased to see that you hold the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Chair at the Hoover Institution. Fuad Ajami was on my dissertation committee at Johns Hopkins SAIS. How did he influence you in your thinking about the region?
I think because he is such a humane person, and he is an empathetic person. Fawad, I think, had deep concern for the peoples of the region, and understood the interconnected nature of the politics, the social, and the religious and ideological dynamics across the region better than anyone. And what he could do is distill his understanding of the complex environment in the most elegant prose. And he was such a gracious man, Andrew. I know you know this as a former student of his. he was a professor in the true sense of the word. He's someone that didn't feel as if he needed to accompany you on your life's journey to tell you exactly what to do, but he was someone who helped you cope with challenges that you encountered, because he had taught you how to think about those complex challenges. So I miss him tremendously, and it is such a great honor to hold a chair that is in his name. And he has so much wisdom. The Hoover Institution here just published posthumously his book on Saudi Arabia entitled Crosswinds, a book that he had ready to go, but of course then he fell ill, and the Arab Spring happened, and events moved faster than he could complete the manuscript. I'm glad to see it published. There's wisdom in that book, as there is in all of his books. I used it to make his case for sustained engagement in the Middle East in an essay that I did recently. I used a quote from Fawad, and it's very simple but elegant and insightful. And the quote is, "It is not a fast part of the world." And so I think what we need is a sustainable, long-term approach to the Middle East that helps the peoples of the region secure the future that they deserve, and a future that is important to all humanity.
Well said. Before we sign off, I just want to encourage our listeners to read Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. We have just been talking about the sections on the Middle East, but HR, you literally cover the world in that book, and the book is also testimony to your distinguished record of service to our country. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
Andrew, what a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
We will be right back after this short break with a few brief closing remarks and takeaways from our conversation with HR McMaster.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
Welcome back. A few takeaways from our conversation just now with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. I especially appreciated his reflections on how his experiences in both Iraq wars informed his approach to Iraq and the region, and how the U.S. is still learning to avoid what he calls the traps of strategic narcissism. That is, seeing the region as we, the United States, wants to see it, rather than as it is, and the need for more strategic empathy. That is, viewing the region through the eyes of the people there. Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East, and thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Rochlin of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other El Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.